Thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to us all, members of Pugwash and some others who are not members of Pugwash, but whom we've been invited, talking us all today. You've had a most impressive, rich and productive academic career, crowned by your appointment as an Emeritus Professor in Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. You're going to talk to us today about runaway wealth, marginalisation, mass marginalisation, environmental limits to growth, and excessive militarisation. I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I certainly know I am. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. We do seem to have some technical problems. I'll assume that everybody can hear me. I think the issue here is to try and just do a fairly broad sketch from just one person's view of the kinds of problems we face more generally, rather than trying to be specific. Now, if we're doing that, I think the significant thing is to try and simplify things a little bit. Obviously, there are many major problems facing us earthwide, if you like. We have the risk of pandemics, there is AI, there is always the background issue of nuclear weapons, which has been so important in the history of Pugwash. And I think we also worry more, perhaps, than people realize about the risks from gene manipulation and indeed biological warfare as a whole, which seems to slip from the headlines in a way, even among specialists. To try and make sense of it overall, I'd start by just doing a quote, and this is a very interesting one from an economic geographer. And he was a very significant figure. He was basically an MP for a short while. He was also an economic geography lecturer at Liverpool University. And he did a paper once in which he looked ahead, and this is from 1973. And he said the real problem we face in the long term, he was speaking over some years ahead, he was really trying to be sort of far-sighted, was we would end up with, and I quote, a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened in the global ghettos of the underprivileged. And I think that, in a sense, sums up the both sort of, how do we call it, the negative. That is what we could end up with. Now, Edwin was saying that 52, 53 years ago, and one has to say we're a lot closer to it now than we were. And his hopes for a more peaceful world, largely didn't come to anything. So what I'd like to try and do is just tease out what seems to have happened under three broad themes, looking at it in terms in perhaps a realistic way, but always recognizing that there are positive ways forward. I'll try and keep it really short because I think questions and answers are far more important here. So I'll try and limit it to about 20 minutes. And Peter, do feel free to interrupt if I get talking too long, because I'm sure the discussion is much more significant. As a rough thing, I would suggest that the three main themes which help us most would be the issue of environment, specifically climate breakdown, the issue of security, particularly our failure to produce in any way a less militarized world, and I suppose the economic problems that we face, what you said in some ways in your introduction. And I think if we look at those in turn, quite briefly, picking out what the problems are, maybe picking out where some solutions are, and then I'll try and do is sort of bring it together. So it's not the usual sort of exercise we do because it's looking very wide, very large, but I think it can have its uses. On the climate side, well, it's appropriate to be talking about the risk of climate breakdown today, of all days. I don't know what it's like where you are. I am in West Yorkshire. It's currently 29 and heading, I think, to the 30s tomorrow, and it's been going on for some time. But the issue is that it's very difficult to really break through to people as a whole, to political class, if not many more, that we really do have a major problem here. That essentially, unless we're able to get to grips with the risk coming from fossil carbonization, the use of fossil carbon, then it's going to be an extremely dangerous world relatively very quickly. And the major change, I think, has happened in the last 10 years on the negative side is the realization that the whole process does seem to be accelerating. Why is it that we're not taking sufficient notice of this? I have to say, I think one of the reasons is that obviously the system that we have at present in terms of using fossil carbon is very well worked, it's very well exploited, and it is very profitable, as you would expect. But the result of the last point is that we do have very powerful lobbies. And the oil and gas industries, in fact, the fossil carbon industry as a whole, have a huge amount to lose if they're cast to one side in the need for rapid, radical decarbonisation. And I think on that basis, it's quite difficult because you're constantly getting a sort of a degree of lobby, including at the major conferences, from people whose job, fair enough, is to ensure that they succeed in what they need to do. How do you get this across to people is difficult to say. You know, there's the old, maybe hackneyed version that if you have a frog in water and heat the water very slowly, it doesn't really do anything until it's too hot to get out. And to some extent, I think we're seeing that. To some extent, you always wonder whether do we have to have major disasters before we really get a change in attitude. Well, the problem here is that we've already had major disasters, and one of the ones that comes to mind is the catastrophe at Derna, that coastal city on the northern coast of Tripoli, of Libya. And if you remember rightly, it didn't get huge attention at the start, but what had happened was a massive flash flood developed in the hills, I think 100 kilometers away, where there'd been 400 millimeters, that's of rain in the space of just a few hours. And what happened was the Wadi Derna, which is a large riverbed which only has water for part of the year, flooded at an incredible rate. And just upstream from the city of Derna, two dams basically were demolished in the flood. There may have been problems with the construction of the rest. But what happened then was this huge wall of water went right through the city and into the sea. The full death toll is not known. It's certainly the official one is about 6,000 people killed. Unofficially, the death toll is believed to be getting on for 20,000. And that was in the space of minutes. It was a very sudden, a flash flood beyond belief. And the problem is that people didn't even appreciate the significance of that. And that would be for a marker for what would happen more and more in the future. As against that, of course, we know far more about what the climate is doing. I think we're far more aware on the scientific side about how important it is. And perhaps most positive of all, even though we'd not have the breakthrough in political change, decarbonisation is technically a lot easier than was considered to be likely 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And that does mean that bit by bit, because it becomes cheaper, it's actually going to be cheaper to do things, to use that form of energy. That is one possibly good sign for the future. But it's going to be hard work because simply of the size of the lobby and the attitude against us, including major political parties. I didn't really want to mention President Trump in this one, I suppose you have to in this context. But essentially, that's a major problem. So you have countries like the United States and Russia with leaderships who do not want to even to recognize this problem. And that, I think, is where it is so important for others to sort of try and make their voices heard relentlessly. So on the climate side, there is some potential for rapid change, but it's the breakthrough that we require. But what about the other issues? There obviously is this whole issue of rethinking security, because one can argue that, you know, unless we change our attitude to make ourselves secure, we're going to miss out on that. We're no doubt going to see some sort of tinkering with the Defence and Security Review if we get the change of Prime Minister. But I think the reality here is that people will not face up in the military, in the security areas as a whole, with where things have gone wrong. And if you look at it bluntly, I think there are two big issues here. One is we do not recognize climate breakdown as possibly the greatest single medium-term threat to human security. And the second is that traditional ways of dealing with presumed threats have not worked. It's so many failed wars we've had. I mean, you look at it. Obviously, there is Afghanistan, 20 years of war, and ended up with Taliban coming back. You had Iraq, that extraordinary war in which within 6 weeks, President Bush was able to give his mission accomplished speak, saying that the war had been won. And instead, it developed into a very complex multi-confessional conflict, which was to last 8 years and leave several 100,000 people killed or maimed for life. And then you have the many others. You have the war against ISIS, that air war, which we tend to forget, 2014-18, which killed 60 to 70,000 people, most, but by no means all supporters of ISIS. Many of them were civilians, but that ISIS was not ended. And in fact, the collapse of Libya, another failed initiative in 2011, meant that it opened up a route for people who were convinced adherents to ISIS and the related groups to be able to move down and essentially spread the message across the Sahel. And that is a major issue we have at the present time, rarely hits the headlines. But I mean, as a matter of interest, it's not quite the Sahel, but most days of many weeks, the United States is still bombing Somalia. And that just does not get recognized. And I think we have to have a huge rethinking security, which is not going to be easy, because obviously there are very strong interests there, which would tend to militate against that. So there, I think there's huge work to do, but it's there for the taking. I mean, it is so blatantly obvious that the way you've been doing things don't work, but there aren't enough people saying it, and saying it with belief that it is not the way forward. But if I may, I'll go on to the last one, and that is the economy, because in some ways this is the more difficult one, because this is obviously more controversial. I think one has to accept that the way the major part of the world economy works is broadly following the neoliberal tradition. And that was really developed back in the 1940s and early 50s and in the Mont Pelerin meetings. And it developed into a different way to regular Keynesianism. And it was far more competitive and believed that basically real progress came from strong competition, which was essentially deregularized. You did not need to have the constraints, which were very much applied then and need applying now. In a sense, that would not probably have come to the fore in the way it did if it hadn't been for what happened in the early 1970s. That was, of course, the huge oil price crunch. I mean, we talk now about oil prices rising by sort of 10, 20, 30%, and that can be pretty disastrous. But just remember, in the OPEC actions in 1973, October 1973, over an 8-month period, 8-month period, oil prices went up by 400%. And that, apart from anything else, threw much of the world economy into a degree of disarray. And that was what in many ways enabled the different approach, the neoliberal approach, to come to the fore. And from then on, we've seen an approach which essentially does put competition first and really just wants to minimize deregulation because it takes the view, honestly, that is the best way for people to progress. The problem is that if you take the more Keynesian view or modifications of that, or look at economic modeling in different ways, you actually have to come to the conclusion that that is not working and we need to move to a new form. What that is, who can say? But certainly one has to remember the values of the Keynesian system and the fact we seem to have lost that. So in a sense, when you put all this together, I know this is fairly hurried, but I want to allow plenty of time for discussion. But when you put this all together, I think we do have a kind of choice ahead of us. If we were to follow where we are now, then I think the probability is that we're going to see an increasingly dystopic world. And I think you would have to go back to what Brooks was saying, the crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth buttressed by stark force. You put those through together and you do get really quite a picture. And it has so many measures of what we see happening all around us. What form that would take, who can say? And it is possible that if we did head downhill with more instability, even the risk of state breakdown, we would eventually decide that we had to find a different way. And that essentially what would be essential would be, I have to say, the kinds of Derna incidents, but on a much larger scale. For example, if the heat dome, which we've seen over Western Europe over the last 2 or 3 days, was 5 to 10 degrees centigrade warmer and lasted longer, then you would have huge mass deaths across much of Europe. That's the brutal reality that we would face. And if we can convince people that that is the kind of thing that we will face unless we make the changes, then it is going to be rather like that. We will have eventually even a degree of state breakdown and societal breakdown. I does not even want to talk in these tones, but in some ways, because of the lack of progress we're making, that is the situation we are in. What are the alternatives? Well, obviously, at root of this, as far as the major problem is concerned, well, it's not the only one, is the need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. We simply do not have enough states prepared to do this, and we do not have enough states to put in the money to those states that are prepared to do it. For various reasons, which we can explore a little bit in the discussion, China has taken a different view and has developed major interests which are essentially concerned with all kinds of decarbonisation and bluntly making money out of it as well. In one way, that, of course, is a good thing. But in another way, it is not necessarily spreading right across the world in the way it needs to do. What you do need, in my experience, and I'd be very interested to hear other people's opinion on that, is essentially across the global south, I think, frankly, a greater awareness of what is required. You see the meeting over in, Colombia quite recently, where you had a gathering of 70 or 80 states, mostly from the global south, investigating how they could cooperate to decarbonize quickly and how wealthy states could help them do it. So again, there's a lot of really good new thinking going on, and it's a question of how that can be transferred. We have to, in fact, to basically find new economic models, or at least modifications of what we have. There are good think tanks doing this. You look at essentially the New Economics model, obviously the New York Economics Organization. You look at many others, and you look at a range of new ideas that are coming through. They need to come through faster. And that, I think, is the issue that we have. And as people who I think I would expect are drawn primarily from scientific communities, that is hugely important. Where are we now? It's a difficulty. You know, we have 7 grandchildren of various ages from 3 through to 17, and we look at what sort of world they're going to be going in if we don't get it. What do I think personally and honestly? I think the reality is that we will get the change. We are capable of rapid change when sufficient people finally reach almost a sort of people-orientated tipping point, and enough people say, this has to change. It is not here in the immediate future, but I sense that it is coming. And again, it's something which I think is very important for us to discuss. But essentially, if we are to make the real progress, we have to prepare to be very blunt about it, very open about it, and I think very honest with anybody who is in public office, particularly politicians. Here and there are politicians who really don't know what's going on. I have to admit, I think it's more in the global south than elsewhere. Rare exceptions, good exceptions in the global north, but not sufficient. And I think somehow we have to break through that and essentially convince people that this has to change. And to borrow a phrase from Mrs. Thatcher used in different ways, actually there is no alternative. It's either that or we have an extraordinary, deeply problematic world ahead of us. I want to avoid this idea of it's all doom-watch because it isn't. And just go back, I'll finish where I started almost, and that is look at what is happening on the capability and the speed of potential decarbonisation. Given the political will, even now, that could be speeded up immensely for very little expenditure compared with the massive expenditure we have on the military systems at the moment. So it can be done. Whether we will do it, who knows? I'm 83. I don't know how far we'll get in my probably limited lifetime now. But for the younger people among us, I think it's hugely important to say this has to change and things do have to improve and rapidly. Can I leave it at that? I've gone on a little bit longer than I should have done, really, because it still gives us the best part of half an hour for discussion. So would you mind, Peter, sort of draw this part to an end and go straight into discussion? There are many things I'm sure we can bring out. Is that okay?
Yes, it certainly is. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to, if I may, ask the first question. In the security context, British and European ministers tend to justify their plans for increased spending on military matters, military forces, by a supposed threat to Europe and to Britain from Russia. Where do you stand on that? Do you think that Europe is at risk of a revanchist Russian invasion of the Baltic states and Poland, or some kind of naval threat to Britain?
There is a risk for Russia to play it more difficultly, particularly with different forms of sort of non-conventional warfare. In terms of Russia basically trying to take over a large parts of Western Europe, no, I do not think so. I mean, apart from anything else, it's the economic comparisons. I mean, Russia's entire GDP is substantially less than that of Germany, just one NATO state. And essentially, it just does not have the power that we're talking about. There are problems within Russia, as we're starting to learn. Against that, I think there have been huge mistakes made on our side. I've got no time for Putin. I think he's a very dangerous person. And he does have these sort of delusions of sort of neo-imperial grandeur. But essentially, the reality in Russia is really pretty difficult. It's certainly the case that many Russians just do not want to talk about the war. They will pretend it didn't exist. And I have good family links here, which sort of confirm that to me. But as far as what Russia is thinking and how Putin is able to get away with it, I think our biggest single mistake from the Western perspective was that when Russia came apart at the seams in the early 1990s, we treated it with a degree of contempt. And I think that has cost us dear in the long term. Russia was a failed state. It embraced a sort of hyper-capitalist path, which was pretty disastrous in the short term. Putin came along and has ever since has been able to remind Russians of how Russia was treated. And that, I think, has been a very big mistake on the European side and the American side as well. But that does not get away from the fact that Putin is a very difficult person to deal with. I do not think that Russia realistically has the power to consider anything greater, probably even less so than it did because of what's the true state of the problems within Russia. So sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but that is the way I think I would handle it.
Yes, it's a very good answer. Thank you. And I find it reassuring that that is how you see things. Over to you, Tim, to chair, if I may.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, thanks, Paul, for your presentation, which was insightful as ever. If anyone wants to ask any questions to Paul, please raise your hand using the React button at the bottom of the screen or post your questions in the chat. I'll ask dear Linda if she wants to make her observation a sec. I see Richard's got his hand up. So, but before we do, Paul, I just wondered if you can reflect on the current state of the nuclear weapons scene internationally. And you talked obviously about the need for there to be greater activism and protest and pressure put on decision makers. But how would you frame the current situation with nuclear issues and the difference perhaps with the 80s when we did see massive public protests and interventions on the world stage on this matter?
Well, obviously, the level of public interest and public concern is much reduced. And I think that's pretty tragic because those of us who work in the field, and you, somebody such as you in particular, are only too well aware that essentially the possibility of any serious endeavor or progress in arms control is pretty minimal at the moment. Apart, of course, from the UN attempt to get a nuclear sort of convention by ban. That we tend to forget that. I can't remember how many states have signed up to that. I think it's 70 or even more than that.
95 now, 95, yeah.
95. So
Yeah.
you've got 95 states, most of them, not all, but most of them from the global south, who plainly do not see this as a good way forward. So you have that at least. And I think it's very important that that exists. And the people who've been working on that, I think, deserve our gratitude. But to some extent, we have to find that we have to point out to people. It may be easier to do with older people, say my generation, who can remember the 1980s and may have been activists at the time, because they know that this has not gone away. But we have to really cross a couple of generations to try and get it through to much younger people. And that, I think, is a task which we really have to embark on with greater intensity now.
Absolutely. Dear Linda, did you want to turn your video and unmute and make your point or ask a question? Otherwise, I'll read out what you posted in chat.
I hadn't planned to speak, but what I put in the chat is just to bring people's awareness to the People's Emergency Briefing. I don't know whether you've been made aware yet, but again, there's a whole group of scientists trying to make people aware of the dangers of what's the unraveling climate chaos, and how we should be responding in a much more practical way and much more urgently. So I think, is that the one that you...
Yeah, and you also made the point about the developments in France as well with regards to...
Oh, yes. Well, that is just ironical. At least I think it is anyway, that Total Energy in France has been found guilty of not delivering on their climate obligations case. This case was brought to court by a French MEP, Marie Toussaint, back in 2018, and they've only just made the decision and the finding. And it came through on the hottest day from France so far, which is just ironical. But anyway, I thought you might like to know.
On the issue of the national emergency, yes, the local groups. My nearest town is Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, and local groups. I think principally Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, and others all got together and organised a showing, and we had about 100 people come. And then it's been shown twice more at other meetings in the past 3 or 4 weeks in and around the Huddersfield area, and it's attracted a lot of attention. I mean, it's very professionally produced. It's scary to some extent, but also speaks with a lot of really very good sense. It depends partly on how one approaches these things, but it's cleverly done. I mean, you actually have some of it's almost a sort of a checkered list of some of the best commentators and best scientists working in the field. So there's all power to that, and I think the more that is shown across the country, the more it's the kind of means which I think is hugely helpful in what is clearly a pretty dangerous time. It doesn't in any way limit the recognition of that, but what it does so, particularly towards the end, the last 2 or 3 contributions, it's more positive about what can be done. It does provide a degree of hope, and I think that's always very important.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so I'll take a couple of hands together and a couple of questions together. So I'll start with Richard and then Alan. So Richard, do you want to unmute and turn your video on?
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. That's as insightful as ever. It's always interesting to hear you. And I realise I owe you a message about biological issues, but I'm very glad you raised biological issues because, of course, one of the recent big sort of global understandings was the impact that something like infectious disease like COVID can have on a modern society. But sort of broaden that out, isn't one of our challenges to find how we can make more resilient societies? Because in a sense, one of the impacts of any kind of military activity or political activity by one country against another is the impact that activity has. The less impact that activity might have, the less likely somebody's going to go down the line of a military action or a spread of a disease. So I was just wondering what you may have thought about how, it's not just inequalities in economies, it's somehow the resilience of society that I think is quite important. Thank you.
Well, taking more questions, or is it? Shall we go straight with that?
Good point. Thank you. Alan, do you want to unmute and share your video?
Thank you very much, Tim. My name's Alan Ware. I'm Global Coordinator of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And I see that Doug Roach is in the chat there. He was the founder of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. So I think he's got a very good question there also on the role of power initiatives and engagement. My question, though, arises to Professor Rogers on your comment that after the end of the Cold War, it seems as though the West treated Russia with disdain, enhanced NATO, built up NATO, focused security on military security, which was in sort of opposition to Gorbachev's proposal, which was for the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, to become the predominant security framework in Europe, not NATO versus Warsaw. So while that, of course, doesn't justify Russian aggression and the horror of what Russia has done, do you have any comments on can we re-establish the authority, for example, of the OSCE and cooperative security as compared to military security and NATO? And secondly, what about the role of the International Court of Justice? Here, there were serious disputes between Ukraine and Russia on what was the political status of Crimea. And I noticed the two countries were just like shouting past each other. Might that have been something that, if that had been taken to the International Court of Justice, what is the legal status of Crimea, might that have prevented the escalation? Because the International Court of Justice has resolved numerous territorial disputes during its time. Thank you.
Did you catch that last bit, Paul?
Yeah, I think enough of it, yes. Well, in a sense, there's three issues there. Obviously, Richard's question, which really revolves around resilience, which I think is a very significant question to consider at the present time. And then, essentially, Alan, both on the OSCE and also the role of sort of international court system, if I can make that wide. All of them are important. Richard, on resilience, yes. I mean, obviously, one is always torn with this because the worst case with this is if people say, well, it's going to get a bit warm, we'll adapt, no problem. And writ small, that is a very wide attitude. We can handle this because it's going to get rather nicer, decent winters and the rest. And of course, it's not like that, because the point is that if you think you can actually adapt, in other words, if you think you can do it purely by resilience, then you're making a huge mistake. That doesn't mean you've not got to have resilience. And that's the paradox. You've got to have resilience because things are already getting worse. I mean, we've seen that in the last 2 or 3 days, the way that, British housing isn't designed to cope. But remember, in 2015, you actually had proposals put forward by certainly the Lib Dems, and I think Labour as well, at the time of the election, that you had to bring in a range of new issues on the housing side. And I think the plan was to have a much higher standard of housing by 2016 or 2017. Within a very short space of time, all new housing had to be built to a higher standard, specifically in relation to essentially direct or indirect emissions. The problem was that was ditched, frankly. And I don't want to get political, but frankly, I think the government of the day after 2015 did us all a lot of damage in this because it threw away so many of these things. The wider issue is that on the resilience side, you must accept that they're going to pay a lot of changes, but that in any ways demonstrates that the need to actually decarbonize is even greater. Because the more you basically try to spend huge sums of money on adapting, the more you find you've got to spend even more because you're not addressing the core problem. So and it's a long-winded way of putting it, but as far as I can see, resilience is important, but you have to go hand in hand with decarbonisation. You can't succeed without decarbonisation, but you can't succeed without resilience increasing because of the mess we've already got ourselves into. Doug, on the OSCE, yes, I was lucky. I was able to spend some time in Moscow on several occasions around the time that Gorbachev came in. And I think one of the tragedies is that he became very unpopular within Russia, and that might have been avoided if there was a different attitude on the Western side. Well, obviously, you got the INF Treaty, which was very important. I mean, first major strategic treaty, which was actually getting rid of, it's a Freudian slip, getting rid of weapons which were more or less state of the art. In other words, it wasn't getting rid of the old weapons, which is all too often what arms control tended to do. And Gorbachev, I think, with Reagan, was able to do that, mainly as a result of what happened at the Iceland summit. But the end result of that was that, in a sense, he did not get the support. I mean, if Western countries, and I had to say including Britain, had made very big symbolic steps forward, then you would have had what the Russians tend to call mutual good example. And essentially, in Western academic terms, gradual and reciprocated reductions in tension, the grit theory. Osgood, I think it was. But essentially, that opportunity was missed. And I think it's a great pity. We had to remember that and not miss those sorts of opportunities in the future. OSCE would have been part of that, and I think we lost that. And Alan, in your other point, which I didn't catch too well because it went very quiet, but I think what you were saying was, why is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, why is it that we do not put enough effort into international law proceedings, going from the Geneva Conventions right through to a whole range of legal questions relating to warfare. And I think that is a loss. And you don't need too many countries to say we cannot allow this to happen. Because basically, a number of countries, I would have to list, I'm afraid, Russia, Israel, and the United States, are playing footloose with from their own perspectives, with some of certainly the International Court of Justice, and I think the International Criminal Court as well. And there are not enough states to say, you cannot do this, and we will help prevent it by the action we take. So there, I'm afraid it's just a plea for better action, as one tends almost to be reduced to when we're looking at all of these issues.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. Got a few hands. Owen Morgan and Douglas Rush. I don't know, Douglas, if you want to ask your question directly to Paul, otherwise I can read it from the chat, but maybe Owen, if you can unmute and turn your video on first of all, please.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Rogers, again for your illuminating lecture. I do speak from a Canadian point of view with the new Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, who has become a rather global star through his Davos speech and the follow-up in his travels and contacts around the world. And I'd like to know what your view is about what can come out of this. Can Mr. Carney sort of lead a disparate group of nations that are sort of wandering in reaction to the the zaniness of the Trump government and so on. So is there a possibility that Canada under Carney can become a leader in developing a better approach to common security in the world?
Thank you, Douglas. Owen Morgan, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I've heard a number of people saying over the past few years that if Ukraine had not signed away the nuclear arsenal that it inherited from the Soviet Union under the terms of the Budapest Memorandum at the end of '94, then Putin would not have invaded and we wouldn't have the ghastly war in Ukraine that we've got at the moment. And that that is actually an argument in favor of the nuclear deterrent. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I would just be interested to hear what your take on that was. Thank
you, Owen. Over to you, Paul.
Well, if we take the first one, I think in a sense, there's a possibility here that Canada could play a major role. I haven't been to Canada since lockdown, so I'm sort of, it's a bit old in terms of, my sort of talking to people across to any great extent within Canada. I think, though, Carney is in a very strong position. And I think it's something which, in other words, one needs to encourage in any way you can to suggest that Canada could have a major role. But if you go back historically, 4 or 5 decades ago, Canada was one of the countries which had a major standing, I think, in the world on many issues. I think for various reasons under different heads, it rather lost that. I think now is the time where a country such as Canada, pretty powerful in its own right, linked in inevitably on a number of issues relating to security, I think it could say things which would strike a chord much more than perhaps many people in Canada realize. Because you have many people right across the world who are actually looking somebody to speak up on their behalf at a more worldwide or global level. And it seems to me that that is an example of where I think it could be significant. Obviously on security, on common security, but also I think on the wider issue of environmental security. Because here again, we know that there's going to be huge problems for countries like Canada, but more than that, we seem to lack every time leaders who will speak up from a position of, if not power, then real influence. I mean, one of the most interesting people, I'm sure you would agree, would be Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. who has a long record on this, looking up very much from a global south perspective. If we were to have just 3 or 4 really significant political leaders, elected political leaders from the global north, I think it could actually make a very big difference, because it would be embarrassing, or whether you can embarrass Trump, but certainly the other politicians can be embarrassed. So yes, I think it would be really very important to, in a sense, have that kind of role. And so, yes, I would encourage anybody in Canada to push that. There's a role waiting to be embraced there. On your issue, Owen, yes, it's an argument to which one does hear. I'm not at all sure that Putin would have been bothered about whether Ukraine had nuclear weapons or not. And I'm not, you simply can't say whether it would have been something which would hold him back. Certainly, he would be willing to make nuclear threats himself, in the knowledge that that could raise high tensions with Western countries. There's a risk that this argument sort of strikes, but the problem with any discussion on deterrence is it completely forgets the nature of nuclear strategy, particularly at the theatre and more tactical level. I remember Malcolm Dando and I tried to write a book about that. In fact, we wrote a book that C&D put out 40 years ago, simply called The Death of Deterrence. And when you look, I mean, the United States, as a member of NATO and a nuclear state, and Britain as another one, neither has a no first use policy. Both have it written in, and Britain has it written in, and you can get parliamentary confirmation of this, that if need be, it would use nuclear weapons first. At a very good start, countries that did that at the moment actually changed their attitude. People can turn around and say, well, they can ditch it quickly. Maybe, but you're forgetting about symbolism. And that, I think, is an important part of this. So, yes, it's a difficult one, but I think you stick with the idea that any move on the nuclear side, you have to recognize it's dangerous. I mean, you know, if you look into any detail about the near misses and the ACT, they're pretty chilling when you get down to it. And it's curious how some of the world's leading politicians or leading strategists, after they've retired, tend to find themselves wanting to move towards a more nuclear-free world. Because away from the tendencies of office, I think some of them come to grips with what they've really been saying and doing and are very worried about it. More of that, I think, needs to be known in the wider public.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. I'd just like to say I am reading all the questions and comments in the chat, and there's a lot of good info and reflections in there. But I'm going to turn now to 2 people who've got their hands up and then try and get everyone else in the chat who've raised questions. So I've got Richard Lawson, but also Martin Rees. I know that you've raised your hand. So Martin, do you want to unmute and turn your video on first and ask your question? Martin, if you're there, if you're available to ask. Otherwise, Richard Lawson, do you want to ask your question? Then maybe Martin.
Okay, just a minute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Martin, you're there. Yeah, hi.
Well, going back to the earlier discussion where you quite rightly said the key thing was for both global north and global south to go to net zero. But would you agree that so long as the economic inequality between the global north and south remains large, there'll still be a problem, getting worse because in the old days, the people in the global south weren't aware of what they were missing. Whereas now with social media, easier travel, etc., they are going to be aware of that. So don't you think that the aim has to be to ensure that the economic inequalities in general diminish?
Absolutely. And this is why I sort of raised that in that second point. I mean, in a sense, a term I've used now for about 30 years is lidism. You look at our attitude to security, it's lidism. You keep the lid on things and try and maintain a degree of stability, but really never really looking at the underlying problems that emerge. I agree entirely with you. I mean, to some extent, again, some of the older ones among us will remember that there's a kind of pop sociology phrase from about 40 or 50 years ago, which said, there was a revolution of rising expectations. There may not have been any improvement in the rich-poor ratio, but everybody was getting that little bit richer. We've moved steadily over the last 30 years into the revolution of frustrated expectations, which eventually ends up with revolts from the margins. And putting those together, I think, is absolutely crucial. And essentially, it's something which goes beyond most people's thinking. But it takes us back to what Edwin Brooke was saying, the crowded, glowering planet. Essentially, the economic system is not working. You do have to move to something which is much better and fairer. Too few politicians will recognize that. Part of the job that we have to do to the very best of our abilities. So yes, I would really endorse what you're saying. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And Richard, do you want to ask your question?
That's very stimulating. I'm writing a website, morepeaceful.world. In the research, just they're widely defined, and I've got quite a handful more of international NGOs, and I wonder if this diversity is a bit of a weakness for us, in that the arms industry are pretty concentrated and are able to lobby the ministers bigly, and I think that maybe our peace NGOs need to coordinate our actions more and focus conceptually and focus in terms of campaigns as to what steps we want the government to take. And I wonder whether maybe a peace manifesto would help us, sort of A4 page with 10 or so items on it, in order to help us to get our heads around what is a very, very wide subject indeed. So I'd be grateful for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes, I think there is that need. I know the major funders like the Roundtree Trust and the quite significant ones like Network for Social Change are concerned with that, and wherever possible do encourage groups to work together. There are good examples. I mean, people are probably aware of one of the most interesting, if small and not well-funded think tanks, is actually the group called Rethinking Security. Now, it only has a staff of really 2, and I think what it does is actually a combination of, I think, some different organizations. Most of them, I think, will be on your list already. But that is one effort, which does mean it does a very interesting set of blogs as well. I mean, that is trying to think through, better ways of handling security. Others do that, of course, as well. Many of them in specialized areas. I think if you have specialized areas, that can be quite useful. But yes, there is the need for coordination to be increased. Some is happening, but I would accept that it is not enough. But I would suggest that people check out Rethinking Security, because it has some very interesting stuff on its website.
Okay, great, Paul. We've got probably a few minutes before we wrap up, and then we'll move on to the AGM. So I've noted in the chat a few points made by Frank, Vicky, and Laurie. So if any of you would like to raise them to Paul or ask questions based on your observations, please unmute and turn your video on now. So that was, I think it was, yeah, Frank Kennedy or Laurie Johnston or Vicky. Just find your question. Vicky Leslie, yeah. Yep, Frank, do you want to go for it?
Hello, Paul. My question is pretty much as worded it in the chat. It arisen most recently from being involved in a couple of showings of the National Emergency Board film that's been discussed, not least in this chat, about climate change. and it's how to reach. I'm like probably everybody else in this conversation, constantly on at my MP, but each of us is only one person, and the people we know are only so many people. And I'm wondering, Paul, or anybody else involved who has regular contact, as these days I don't, with a range of politicians and potentially ministers, is it just everybody just get more people to make basic points to their representatives, or is there a need to try and focus on getting more people, whether it's prominent people, whether it's specialists, whether it's celebrities, younger people, maybe young voters, or particular groups of people, or somehow to target what we do in a different way?
Thank you, Frank.
I honestly don't know. I think it's a very important one, but it is tricky. I used to have a fair bit of contact with successive Labour leadership teams years ago. That basically ended a few years back. I think change of leadership. People didn't really want to know about this. I mean, obviously, I'm active with the Peace and Justice Project, which was started by Jeremy Corbyn. And I think what some of the stuff that Zach Polanski is basically saying among the Greens is really very interesting in this. And some of the work that's going on within the Greens about security, I think is very positive. But the trouble is that, as soon as somebody like that raises their head on this issue, then I had to be blunt about it. The billionaire print media, they're almost consigned to outer darkness. I mean, I remember what Corbyn experienced after came fairly close to an electoral shock back in 2017. I mean, after that, the way that he was basically pilloried the whole time in large sectors of the press. Well, in fact, Zach Polanski is facing that now. They're eco-nuts. These are dangerous people. But that is becoming common. So one is really having to face up to that, which means that people who are prepared to talk to MPs have to have a resilience of purpose themselves. If they do, then I think many MPs are willing to listen, because many MPs will have been getting messages over what's happening over the last few days. The fact that it's been very difficult for people, for mums and dads whose kids have been off school suddenly with no means of looking after them. So I think one has to, in a sense, concentrate on areas where you have an opening, which may be unexpected, and then play it hard with MPs and with their personal assistants. So yes, I would agree with that.
Thank you, Paul. Vicky or Laurie, you don't have to necessarily turn your video on, but you can just ask your question via audio. Vicky, I know you said you can't turn your camera on, or I can ask your question or you'll raise your point for you. It's up to you.
Hello. Yeah, I'm one of those people who suddenly had the kids off school, and we've just found out they're off school tomorrow as well with a red alert. So yeah, it wasn't really a question really. Well, I suppose, I don't know if anybody knows more about it, but when Paul was talking about how there's so much less kind of awareness in general of nuclear weapons and all of the issues now as compared to the 80s, I just popped into the chat that the team behind Adolescence, the big Netflix show from, was it last year? I can't remember now. But it created like a big political discussion, and Keir Starmer was weighing in, and they are apparently remaking Threads, which I'm sort of like I have mixed feelings about it, because Threads, stands alone and is kind of an extraordinary piece of work, but it's also very much of the 80s. So I don't know. I haven't seen much more about it since it was announced. I don't know when they say if it's like actually a remake of that story characters that time, or if they're kind of making an updated version set like now with slightly more relevant to the 2020s. But either way, if a drama could have the kind of impact on public debate that Adolescence had in terms of nuclear weapons issues, I guess that would be great.
Yeah, I agree very much, Vicky. Let's just hope that it actually is not just a remake, but a comprehensive update for the current age. If it is, then it could be one of the things. If anybody can find out who's making it, then try and put in a bit of influence. Say that, you know, this is critically important, that this must be really up to date. Threads was brilliant. In some ways, the war game was extraordinary a decade or two earlier. So by all means, if something like that can happen, anything anybody can do to encourage them to really be up to date in their treatment, I think would be brilliant.
There was also, I don't know if anybody saw the House of Dynamite, which is on Netflix, that came out at the end of last year, which is Catherine Bigelow, you know, big Hollywood director.
Yes.
But that kind of, I don't know, it was a great sort of gripping film in some ways, but I don't know how useful it was really in terms of, I guess it's getting these issues into people's living rooms to some extent.
And I think the thing about Threads was it was dealing with ordinary people, which I think was so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Vicky, Frank, thanks so much. Yeah, I just wanted to raise, Frank, with your point about influencing politicians, that British Pugwash has set up a parliamentary forum on nuclear weapons issues, and we've got a meeting next Monday in Parliament. You can see it on our website, and you can also join British Pugwash. I put the link in the chat to find out more information about it, because the NPT review conference, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, was held a few weeks ago, and so we're meeting with MPs. We've got a group of MPs from across different political parties, including Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems and Greens. So that's something we're trying to do. But yeah, you can stay in touch with that, and you can come along to meetings if you happen to be in London by following us on our website. Paul, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Peter now to wrap up the meeting, and then we shall close.
Thank you, Tim. Paul, very briefly, you've offered us I think, some outstanding nuggets of wisdom concerning several of the fundamental questions of our time, the questions and challenges facing those of us who are alive today. So I think we should all be extremely grateful to you for that. It certainly made for a very stimulating and interesting and wide-ranging discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for organising this. It's been a marvellous opportunity, and the discussion in particular raised so many issues. Thank you.